Good afternoon. It's nice to have some flowers up here on a rainy day like this. It's good to be back with my church family here. It seems like about half the time I'm traveling somewhere, either for work or various other reasons. It was almost a year ago now, on Tuesday, December 20th, 2016, when I loaded up my car full of things to live off of for 7 months. And I drove down to San Francisco, and then down to Los Angeles after that, and flew to Guatemala for 2 weeks. And I came back from Guatemala and drove across the country to Ohio. And even there, I went to ABC and traveled with the chorale, going to Nashville, Chicago, went to Washington, D.C. And then I did a 3-week road trip back. And then I moved to Seattle. I lived with the Bradleys for a little while. And they live in this beautiful home out in Monroe, but it's out in Monroe. And I commuted to and back and forth to work, an hour and a half each way. And then I moved to Everett and commuted back and forth to work. And that was an hour each way, so it was better. But my life has been on the move a lot. And, a life like this, it's exciting, it's adventurous, but it's also filled with instability and uncertainty where I'm going next or what I'm going to do next. And in all of this, I began to ask a question: where shall I call home? And how do I find this place, home? A couple weekends ago, I went and visited the house I grew up in and saw my mom. And when it was time to go, I felt distressed for some reason, and I couldn't figure it out. Was it the drive back, the traffic? But when I was in the car, it became clear to me. I started to cry. I remembered all the good memories I had back at home, and I wanted a home. A couple weekends ago, I came back from one of my trips to Texas, and came back to the house I was staying in Everett, and found I didn't even have a place to talk to my parents to in private. And so I put on my shoes and put on my coat, and I talked to them as I walked through the streets in Everett. And in that moment, I wasn't homeless, but I felt homeless. And I talked to my parents in the usual way until my frustration was just so much. I punched a stop sign, expressing how frustrated I was, and told my parents, I just want a place to call home. Hear my prayer, O Lord, and give ear to my cry. Do not be silent to my tears, for I am a stranger with you, a sojourner, as all my fathers were. Those are the words of David in Psalm 39, in verse 12. David spoke to God, saying that he was a stranger and a sojourner on this earth. He was living a temporary existence. And then later on in the book of Hebrews, we read the author wrote to us saying, they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. For those who say such things declare plainly that they seek a homeland. The story of the pilgrim is not a new one. It's played out over and over in life after life. We just celebrated Thanksgiving, remembering the pilgrims that came to our country. But even before then, we're more pilgrims. If you'd all turn with me over to Psalm 95. Psalm 95. In this book, we have recorded the story of an entire nation of pilgrims who left their home in Egypt for a new home. But if you remember in this story, there was an entire generation that never reached home. So it seems as though there's a way to go about finding a home that won't work. And we read about this in Psalm 95 and in verse 7. Today, if you will hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as in the day of rebellion, as in the day of trial in the wilderness, when your fathers tested me, when they tried me. Though they saw my work, for 40 years I was grieved with that generation and said, it is a people who go astray in their hearts, and they do not know my ways. So I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. These Israelites, they were very dissatisfied with their situation. They were out in the desert living in tents in a temporary existence. And they said things like, We're going to die out here. There's no water. We want meat. We're getting tired of this miracle stuff that's falling from the sky. And they even said, if only we could go back to Egypt. Couldn't they have just been satisfied with what God gave them? That he just saved them from one of the greatest armies at that time and led them through a sea of all things? But apparently not. They focused on their problems and what was difficult about their temporary situation rather than trusting in God to lead them home. Turn with me to James 4:1. James 4:1. These Israelites, they were so dissatisfied that they even came to the point of full-scale rebellion where many lives were lost. In James chapter 4, the author James asks, where do wars and fights come from among you? Do they not come from your desires for pleasure that war in your members? You lust and do not have, you murder and covet and can't obtain. You fight and war. So when we think of the things we don't have, we grow in dissatisfaction. When I was out on that street on that cold fall night, I was focusing on the problems that were at hand in my life and all of the things that were troubling to me, and my mind was at war. And I even began to wonder, I've been praying about a place to live for a while. Will I ever find a place to live? I had doubts in my mind. In James chapter 4 and verse 2, yet you do not have because you do not ask, and you ask and do not receive because you ask amiss, that you may spend it on your pleasures. So if you have a viewpoint of desire in your mind when you ask, is God going to give it to you? Well, let's look back a page or two in James chapter 1. James chapter 1. God tells us, ask in faith with no doubting, for he who doubts is like a wave of the sea driven and tossed by the wind. For let not that man suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. So in that moment, I was like a wave being tossed by the wind. And I had doubts. But you know what? Is God going to give something to someone who's dissatisfied? If God gives something to someone who is dissatisfied, isn't there more to be had even after they get what they ask for? And isn't the grass always greener on the other side? Does God want us to have things, or does God want us to have happiness? Now, I told my parents about this, and my dad reminded me, it's not a new thing to be in a trial like this. They told me about the time when they were looking for a house and wondered if they were ever going to find a house to live in. And my mom told me about the hard situations she's lived in too. So we see a few verses prior in James 1:2, a verse we're all familiar with at least. Count it all joy when you fall into various trials. And my parents asked me, so what is it specifically that's such a trial? What are the problems you're facing right now? And I explained it to them. And as I explained all the little things that bothered me, an idea emerged. A little seed of an idea started to grow. Verse 3, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience. If I was patient in the little things, I could be patient in the bigger things. If I was patient about backing in and out of this driveway that's narrow and has brick walls on either side, you have to pay attention and focus. If I was patient in that, and if I was patient in the long commute I had every day, and if I was patient in finding something in a crowded room, I could be patient in something bigger, like finding a new place to live. But let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. Now let's turn back to Psalm 95, Psalm chapter 95. At the end of that psalm, we saw how not to find home, what prevented these Israelites from ever reaching their homeland. But in the beginning of the psalm, we see a different mindset. In verse 1 of Psalm 95, we can read, "O come, let us sing to the Lord. Let us shout joyfully to the rock of our salvation. Let us come before his presence with thanksgiving. Let us shout joyfully with psalms. This is the other mindset. Instead of thinking in terms of what we do not have, we can think in terms of what we do have. It's the pilgrim mindset. We just celebrated Thanksgiving. And these pilgrims that came to the United States, they chose not to think about all the trials they faced, but they chose to think about all of the things they were thankful for. Last week, preceding Thanksgiving, I decided to stop asking God for a home, but just tell him what I'm thankful for. I focused on the things that made me content. Like on a cold, drizzly morning, waiting for a bus, I thought of all the things in this unpleasant situation that I could be thankful for. I had a warm jacket on. There was a bus shelter next to me, giving me a little bit of shelter from the rain. There were street lights lighting up the dark morning, and I didn't have to wait that long for a bus. And once I was on the bus, it would be warm, and I could just go to work without worrying about traffic. And so I could be patient with something like this, and I could be patient with finding a new place to live. And on the Sunday before Thanksgiving, I just designated that to be the day when I would go look online, see what places are out there that I might be able to move to. But at this point, I wasn't in a hurry. I started with Bible study and then joined an online Bible study group. And it wasn't until 1 p.m. that I actually started on a day that I was thinking I'd spend the whole day. But that was okay. I knew that God would work things out. And even if that meant him saying, Keith, the place you're at right now, that's home, I knew I would find home. And that day, I did find home. Because the truth is, you can never find home unless you find contentment. And you might even go so far as saying that home really is nothing more than just a place and a state of mind of being content and happy with what you have. And so on that Sunday, I found a home. And 3 days later, on Thanksgiving Day, I signed a lease for an apartment I had never seen before. Sean and Kelly is the one who checked it out, and so it was kind of an act of faith that this would work out. And you know what? It did. Yesterday, on my birthday of all days, I moved into this new place, this new home, in a beautiful, newly remodeled apartment, and they even gave us December rent free. I can't even, it's one of those miracles that you know it was worked out by no one else but God. So, Psalm 95, "O come, let us sing to the Lord, let us shout joyfully to the rock of our salvation. Let us come before his presence with thanksgiving. Let us shout joyfully to him with psalms." We're all spiritual pilgrims in this spiritual journey to find our home. We live in these temporary lives, and we have choices each day to be either satisfied with what we have, or we can have desires that we want to have filled. We have a choice of being patient or a choice of being full of war in our minds. So I encourage all of you, don't seek that mindset of desire, but seek it in contentment. Make yourself at home.